In 2 weeks, parliamentary elections will be held in Hungary. 58% of potential voters are ready to vote for the opposition party TISA, while the ruling Fidesz party is supported by just over a third of the population. Sensing defeat, Viktor Orbán is doing everything he can to hold on to power. Andrei Dimitrenko continues the story.
Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who is losing support, is making every effort to mobilize his conservative electorate ahead of the parliamentary elections. On March 27th, he held a pro-government rally in the city of Győr, which has traditionally supported his Fidesz party. However, this time there were a lot of opponents of the head of government present. Orbán could not stand the booing and began accusing opposition supporters of working for Ukraine.
You support the Ukrainian side instead of standing with the Hungarians. You want a pro-Ukrainian government and want to give Hungarian money to Ukraine.
Blaming Kiev for all of Hungary's problems. Viktor Orbán's favorite tactic. Posters with portraits of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky are hung all over the country. The Prime Minister blames the stagnation of the economy and inflation on what he claims is energy blackmail by Kiev. On January 27th, Russian oil stopped flowing to Hungary through the Druzhba pipeline, which passes through Ukrainian territory. A Russian drone entered the fuel pumping system, but Orbán categorically denies this, shifting the blame to Kiev. Demanding the resumption of Russian oil transit, the head of government has already blocked the transfer of 90 billion euros in EU financial aid to Ukraine. Orbán has also ordered a halt to gas supplies to Ukraine starting from the third quarter of this year.
If Hungary began its path in the European Union with very high economic and social indicators now, its position, not only within the European Union, but also among other Central European countries, looks increasingly poor. And let's put it this way, if not dire, then at the very least, sad. And therefore, someone must be held accountable for this. Naturally, Orbán understands that someone needs to be held responsible. And he has specifically designated the European Union, Brussels, and above all, Ukraine, and the war in Ukraine.
58% of potential voters are ready to vote for the opposition party TISA, while Orbán's Fidesz is supported by just over a third of the population, according to a study by the Median Institute of Public Opinion. Analysts believe that it looks like the future Hungarian parliament may become a two-party system.
If the results of the current poll are confirmed on April 12th, this will give the TISA party even a two-thirds majority. And since the smaller parties have been fluctuating around 1 to 2% in the polls for several months now, and even in March this year, the Mi Hazánk electorate also appears to be shrinking, even among voters who have already decided on a party, it does not reach the electoral threshold. Therefore, at present, a two-party parliament does not seem like an unlikely development. From a publication by the Havigi newspaper.
To attract voters, Viktor Orbán is trying to leverage his international connections. The head of government has constantly emphasized his supposed personal friendship with US President Donald Trump and has publicly supported his initiatives. A week before the elections, US Vice President J.D. Vance is expected to visit the country. However, analysts say that relying too heavily on Washington may not help score many political points.
It's not certain that this support will be all that effective. That's the question. Of course, for some Hungarian voters and right-wing conservatives in Europe, they are flattered that the President of the United States is showing interest in such a small country and its elections, which are relatively minor on the world stage. But how much does this... For some, it might even be irritating. In other words, Orbán's core electorate is pleased by this, but they would vote for Orbán anyway. But for those who are undecided, Trump's involvement could even backfire.
Two American senators, one from the Republican Party and one from the Democratic Party, are planning to introduce a bill that would impose sanctions on high-ranking officials in Hungary for purchasing Russian energy resources and blocking aid to Ukraine, according to the Financial Times, citing sources. According to the publication, the text of the bill does not explicitly name Orbán as the target of the restrictions. It will be up to the US administration to determine exactly which Hungarian officials may end up on the blacklist. Andrei Dimitrenko for Frida TV channel.
Alexander Leonov, Executive Director of the Center for Applied Political Studies, Pienta, is joining our broadcast. We will discuss this Hungarian story with him, the electoral one. Yes, and not only that. Welcome. Glad to see you, and glory to Ukraine.
Hello?
Glory to the heroes. Good morning to you too.
Alexander Valentinovich, how would you personally assess Orbán's chances of keeping his position and, accordingly, his team after the elections, which will already take place in April?
Apparently, there is a psychological breakdown. There has been a psychological breakdown among the voters. And it seems to me that for Orban to keep his position, at this point in time, it seems that only a miracle or perhaps some kind of massive, large-scale election fraud could possibly help him now. And there is already a significant amount of talk circulating about various attempts to buy off votes or to directly bribe the voters. However, exactly how successful Orban will ultimately be in this specific regard is actually quite hard for anyone to say for certain. Apparently, it looks like Orban made a very serious mistake and, he really went much too far, as the saying goes. And here it's believable that he is being helped by Russian political strategists because there have actually been quite a lot of attacks on Ukraine and Brussels. These attacks are absolutely extremist in nature, and even Hungarian voters who don't have a very positive view of Ukraine find them rather alien, especially since the attacks on the European Union are not popular in Hungary. Hungary is actually categorically opposed to any actions against the EU. At this specific juncture, it is crucial that we take a moment to point out something that is actually quite important to understand. The undeniable fact that Viktor Orbán chose to make Volodymyr Zelensky and the nation of Ukraine his primary political opponent seemed to be a somewhat logical strategy at the very beginning of this process, largely because his most significant political rival, Péter Magyar, had essentially managed to acquire what many observers describe as a Teflon-like image. And consequently, all of the various political attacks, including even the most aggressive video provocations, seemed to have absolutely no effect whatsoever and did not actually exert any real influence on the overall course of the elections. Consequently, Viktor Orbán found himself looking for a brand new opponent, and he eventually found one in the person of the Ukrainian president. But in this specific situation, his public statements were rather extreme, I repeat, because Orbán was almost talking about the potential use of military force. He said he was ready to use it against Ukraine and even hinted at some kind of military solution, against the backdrop of the fact that throughout his entire term, Orban had been saying that he was actually a guarantor of peace. This created a kind of dissonance among his voters. And now we are really seeing this divide, which is growing. It is growing primarily due to those who were undecided and have now started to make up their minds. Because indeed, among all these attacks on Ukraine, Orban does not give the main answer. Issues like systemic corruption and the struggling economy are major concerns. And obviously, many voters are already becoming quite tired of these constant attacks on Ukraine. Moreover, most Hungarians still do not see the situation in Ukraine as being such a significant threat, as some might suggest. Orban is trying to portray, although, I would still point out that the current political game being played by the Prime Minister of Hungary is actually exceptionally risky and potentially dangerous. From what point of view? From a perspective. Because creating the image of Ukraine as an enemy could lead to a situation where a number of parties that are currently marginal in Hungary could, within a cycle or two, actually become part of the political landscape. Unfortunately, something similar. We saw this in Poland when the attempt to play the Ukrainian card during the elections led to the fact that now Confederation and a number of parties that are essentially anti-Ukrainian are polling at 20% in possible elections. And from this point of view, these processes are dangerous. Unfortunately, we can say that if Russian political strategists are working there, this is precisely one of the goals of their work. To increase chaos and distrust both towards Ukraine and towards European institutions.
And everyone who supports the policy of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán is directly helping Russia. This was stated by Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski. And he explained that Orbán's government regularly blocks European Union sanctions against Moscow and hinders funding for Kyiv. Sikorski added that such a position by Viktor Orbán has concrete consequences for the security of the entire region. And what will happen next? Considering that many analysts are examining what the Hungarian parliament might look like, which forces will prevail, well, basically, no matter how you look at it, we'll still have to keep living with representatives from Fidesz. Orban can still remain in politics. But in what capacity? That's what I like to understand. Alexander, how do you assess this? Look, according to the data from the research center, TISA could get 115 seats, while Fidesz only 78. The median service suggests that given current trends, the opposition may even be able to claim constitutional majorities of 2/3. Well, and also the preservation of power. Fidesz. Perhaps, yes, pro-government analysts predict that the opposite will happen. This is 117 seats for Fidesz against 69 for TS, citing the authorities' advantages in single-member constituencies. Indeed, many people are saying that Orbán is counting on the majoritarian system. How do you assess this balance of political forces in the future parliament?
At the very least, right now, at this specific moment in time, the gap between the supporters of Fidesz and those of TS is really widening significantly. And indeed, when we look at the current data, we could be talking about a very substantial and meaningful advantage. Then let's be honest, this will inevitably be reflected in the majoritarian system as well. Although even in the majoritarian system, Orban has the opportunity to use administrative resources and financial resources to boost his popularity and increase votes in his favor. Nevertheless, it seems to me that right now, the main task is to minimize the gap as much as possible. And as they say, if this gap turns out to be small, Orban may start taking actions aimed at, for example, not recognizing these elections, delaying the transfer of power as much as possible. Here we should remember that Hungary is still part of the European Union, and it will be quite difficult for Orban to act in a completely arbitrary manner, especially since, let's say, attitudes toward Orban in Europe right now are, to put it mildly, not very positive. They are even considering the possibility of drastically reducing funding to Hungary if Orban remains in power. And here there is an important question: what will actually happen if TISA wins? I think that if there is a constitutional majority, then Peter Magyar will carry out his threat and essentially purge Hungary of Orban's people. If the advantage is not large enough to secure a constitutional majority, nevertheless, I think that Orban will enter a rather difficult period in his life because there are many accusations of corruption and many claims, including about his ties to Russia. Because, you know, when people say that Orban is an agent of Russian influence, and they cite many absolutely valid examples, such as blocking sanctions against Russia, blocking aid to Ukraine, and so on. Perhaps the most glaring and striking example of Orban working in favor of Russia is his consistently and single-handedly blocking Sweden's accession to NATO for a period of an entire year, even when Turkey finally dropped its own objections, despite Hungary having no legitimate formal reason or strategic justification to raise them. Orban didn't even have such formal reasons, but nevertheless, he blocked this possibility until the very end. If this isn't an example of Orban working for Russia, then what else are we supposed to look for? And from this point of view, it seems to me that Orban's chances of staying in power are now minimal. But, you know, there have also been various speculations, including the possibility of provocations, for example, staging an assassination attempt on Orban. I also truly agree that Trump's support and Jay Devon's visit, especially against the backdrop of the war in Iran, are more likely to work against Orban. And those who are undecided are more likely to side with the opposition, because the opposition is talking about the issues that concern Hungarians. But Orban talks about Ukraine and the European Union and doesn't provide any answers. And how will Hungary's problems be solved? Again, corruption and the economic crisis.
Thank you for the conversation, and thank you for joining us on our morning broadcast. We thank Alexander Leonov, Executive Director of the Center for Applied Political Studies, PENTO, who was with us live.